Hey, everybody. I have a real treat for you today. You're going to get to hear an interview I did with the great, the wonderful, the one and only Jeff Deist. If you don't know that name, you're going to remember it. This is a great interview. Let me give you his official bio, which barely does the man justice. Jeff Deist is General Counsel for Monetary Metals. Jeff previously spent 10 years as president of the Mises Institute. Eh? Where he wrote hundreds of articles and delivered countless speeches on topics of monetary policy, gold, and central banking. That's an understatement. Prior to that, he worked on Capitol Hill as chief of staff for one Congressman, Ron Paul. He also worked as an attorney in law firms and public accounting firms specializing in private equity, mergers and acquisitions, and tax. Jeff holds degrees in law and taxation. This is an impressive dude, and this is a great conversation. I had an awful lot of fun doing this one, so enjoy.
Haman Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Haman.
Well, hello, Jeff Deist. Welcome to Haman Nature.
Adam, good to see you.
Thank you so much for doing my little show. I already read my audience your bio, so if you are amenable, I'd like to just. You are a man of ideas. Let's start talking ideas.
Well, I feel like we're running out of them at this point
Boy,
in
ain't that
America.
the
I mean,
truth?
Trump versus Biden is the best we can do, really.
Yeah, it seems like we're trying to do the other extreme, the other pole, whatever the opposite of good and
hmm
enlightened in the public service
hmm
is.
hmm
We're doing the other
Well,
thing.
I do notice this shift in the rhetorical tone and tenor of our elected officials. Did you see that tweet just a couple days ago? I don't know when this will air, but this is last week. Amy Klobuchar, the senator from, I don't know, like Minnesota. Excuse me, I forget.
Somewhere like that, Iowa or
Yeah,
Minnesota. Yeah.
yeah. So she basically said, "We were up till 3 a.m. passing this omnibus. You know, you're welcome." And it was basically her way of saying, "Oh, these terrible Republicans are obstructionists, and if it weren't for them, we'd have all these. The roads would be paved with gold. We'd have all these spending bills, no problem." And it was just the tenor of it's changed, and I've noticed that there's no longer a pretense amongst, let's say, our national politicians to even appeal to or even pretend to represent everybody, right? If you're Amy Klobuchar, deplorable Trumpers in red states are almost they're beyond salvation. They're almost subhumans, and basically they deserve to be vanquished in a political sense. And we all know where vanquishing people in a political sense can lead. It can lead to vanquishing people in a more literal sense. And
Yep.
obviously, there are plenty of episodes in just the 20th century that we can look to that. And of course, nobody ever looks at an Amy Klobuchar, who's probably like an NPR Minnesota type, and says, "Well, there's a proto tyrant." But that's exactly what she is. Tyranny won't necessarily be wearing a jackboot.
Right.
It will be the bland face of this sort of corporatized neoliberal
Right.
Amy Klobuchars of the world who say, well, we can't have free speech. We can't have this and that. So, but just I thought her tenor in that tweet was so indicative of, Joe Biden doesn't pretend to be president to everybody.
Right.
He basically says, oh, these MAGA extremists or whatever. Well, okay, but and that I guess that's good in the sense that our politics is getting more honest and open.
Right.
Maybe
That's my
that
feeling.
wakes some people up. But it is a shift. It is a shift from in my own lifetime. Bill Clinton didn't say things like that about good old boys in Arkansas.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's a change.
I find the honesty
rhetorical
refreshing.
shift.
Yeah, I don't think much has changed in reality, but I like to see the mask slip. I don't think they ever really represented all of us, maybe even none of us. I think they serve themselves. And it brings up the specter, maybe we shouldn't all live in the same polity if it's so obvious that we detest one another, or our leaders at least detest the other side. You know,
Well, you would think that that's something everyone could agree on, but there is a progressive mindset that cannot be satisfied.
that's for sure.
It's absolutely relentless, and it constantly seeks to expand its sphere of influence and power. And I would say that there are right progressives too. We call them neoconservatives.
Right.
But in general, right now, the progressive left, I would argue, is ascendant in the West. And the idea that, well, why not divorce yourself politically from these red state people whom you despise? Why, then you wouldn't have to worry about who they elect senator. You wouldn't have to worry about the Supreme Court voting to overturn Roe v. Wade, whatever it might be. When you look at the wish list of left progressive political goals, and of course that's ever changing because again, it can never be satisfied. But if you had red states governing themselves and blue states governing themselves, and those blue states right here, right now, with no change in the electorate, could have universal health care, could have abortion on demand, could ban guns, could have very high rates of taxation. You could have hate speech laws. You could have all kinds of legal protections for LGBT folks and women and this, that. I mean, you could basically have the entire progressive left wish list right here, right now, today, if blue states were permitted to govern themselves. So you ask yourself, well, why don't they take that deal?
Because the urge to dominate is what's really motivating them. That dovetails into one of the first times I really noticed you. You reached out right through my computer screen and grabbed my brain and shook it because you had a very interesting and unique point about how the errors that libertarianism or the liberty movement was making in their universalist approach to liberty. And you said we're doing it wrong. If I recall, I mean, you made a pitch for a much more decentralized approach to this, rather than like when I was coming up, and reading, the standard libertarian tomes. It was all about, we've got the right ideas and the other people just don't understand it. If we could just preach the good word and get everybody, or at least a voting majority, to believe in libertarian political philosophy, then our political unit will be good and proper. And you said, what's the point of using democracy to force our views on others, and B, that's just tactically unsound. Isn't it better to secede, whether geographically or politically or any other way? I don't know. Maybe you could say that better than I did, but I thought that was a really interesting point you made.
Well, I think a form of soft secession is happening.
Yeah.
And it's not always geographic. Sometimes it's mental. But so many things we think are universal aren't universal. That's a problem. In other words, a conception of property rights, a conception of the individual versus society, the state, however you want to characterize it. These are not universal. There are other cultures on Earth.
Right.
If you go to Asia, depending on what part of Asia you're in, of course, you'll find a very different ideal of the individual's role in society. So I've always argued that we got pulled into this universal doctrine. You can call it the Enlightenment. You can call it liberalism. You can call a more modern version of it Rothbardianism, from basically the ethics of liberty, the framework in that book. There's lots of different ways you could couch it, but I just suspect that there's a lot of people, maybe a majority of people on Earth, who are just never going to buy into that program and who are never going to accept it. And so the question becomes, A, what do you do in the shorter term? And B, is it really your goal to impose it? Right? I mean, I'm not so sure that liberty is popular in the way we use that term. We use that term as the absence of state intervention in your life, right? Even in the West, where we have people from the same culture, that is not at all what liberty is. To left progressives in the West, liberty is a set of conditions. It's a positive set of conditions where you can self-actualize because you don't have to worry about things like rent and food. Medical care is free, education is free. In other words, there's a baseline of conditions, material conditions, that make you free to go be who you really are, to live out loud, because you don't have to worry about all these things. And it's actually very Soviet. It's almost very Marxist, because this idea was like, when everybody doesn't have to worry about food and rent and everything, then they'll be able to go be that poet they really were meant to be, instead of working some 9 to 5 just to get by. And it's like, yeah, most people aren't poets. Most people would be terrible poets, right? I mean, so the idea that we're all missing out on our true calling because of the workaday demands of our bills is, of course, absolute nonsense. But
it's very attractive, though. I mean, if you can just change your belief system and then all of a sudden scarcity ceases to be a thing, well, who's not going to go for that?
Well, if we can't agree on what liberty is, even amongst our fellow Westerners, then it strikes me it's an awfully hard sell globally.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And so there are certainly better and worse places on Earth. There are certainly better and worse cultures on Earth, richer, happier, more prosperous places. And so I think on the purely political side, now, obviously, I think there are truisms or principles or universal natural laws and natural rights that apply to all human beings. Sure, you shouldn't be allowed to aggress against a person's body, for example. But beyond that, how that all manifests politically ought to be wide open, in my perspective.
Well, I've got another podcast I think I told you about off air called Natural Order. I do with Brian O'Leary, my buddy, and this one's called Haman Nature, and you can see obviously what that alludes to. So what I'm interested in is understanding what our nature is, and given the environment that we're in, the nature of the universe, I'm trying to figure out the best way for humans to exist such that we flourish. And part of that is, understanding economics. Part of that is understanding political philosophy. I do believe that libertarianism, if man is to survive, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, I think it's going to be that political philosophy that's dominant, or we're going to be constantly in conflict. My only quibble, is I just don't think we should be enforcing that on anybody else. I don't want us to go, in the neoconservative direction and go impose our value system on the Middle East or whatever. I think it's evil. You can't. The means are the end.
Well, when we talk about human nature or any kind of organic ordering of society without this really brutal state as an overlord, then I think you have to understand that that's just the marketplace. I mean, that's all possible naturally or organically. And to me, that's not an ideology. That's not a utopia that has to be imposed. It's the opposite. It's what happens when you don't impose on people. So I increasingly don't think our program should be viewed in ideological terms. I don't think, I would say people on both the left and right think libertarians are super ideologues. They read all this theory and all this philosophy, and they have this highly ideological view of the world. And I used to think that too, but I don't think that anymore. I think liberty is just nature. It's what happens naturally, organically, when human beings come together and try to coexist and survive. All kinds of things come from that. Trade comes from that. Security comes from that. Police and courts come from that.
What do you think about this framing, that under a system of liberty, what happens is a discovery process by which our natural interactions, private property rights, freedom of association, or organic trade, it's a discovery process of the way we ought to live rather than something ideological and imposed top down. It's the ultimate bottom up, a way of being, which seems to me the proper one for our species.
And another word for that is common law.
Yes, exactly.
Right, where we discover what's best and what's just as we go, as opposed to we live in a very positive law system now in the West, where legislatures do everything and courts do everything, and they kind of boss us around. But this discovery process is so important because you have to fill in the blanks. You have to fill in the mortar around the bricks. And that by filling in, I mean in terms of geography and in terms of time, temporally and geographically. And what that means is that what's appropriate for governance, let's say, not government, what's appropriate for governance and law in one setting may be inappropriate in another. And this is where libertarians tend to lose the plot on universalism, which you mentioned, but also on proportionality.
Yes.
What's proportional? If you steal a man's horse in the Arizona desert in 1800, that you might be consigning him to death in the middle of the hot desert, no water around, no transportation. And so horse thieves used to be treated pretty harshly when horses were the main transportation. Whereas if today you go to some stable in a fancy part of Kentucky horse country and in the middle of the night and steal a horse, you're not consigning anyone to death. That's more of a property type crime. And we would probably say, well, that doesn't warrant the death penalty. And so why is that? Well, because the two circumstances are very different. And I think this idea that we can legislate our way to understandings, broad understandings, universal understandings is pretty dangerous. And it leads to, I think, it leads to the Amy Klobuchars of the world, who see that there's only one way, her way, the way. And that's basically what I guess we'd call social democracy. And that's it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I had Stefan Kinsella on the show. I think it was my first interview. And we talked a lot about the difference between law and legislation. And boy, they're almost polar opposites. And the horse example that you just raised brings up another issue. There's a lot of libertarians that think like the non-aggression principle is useless as a principle because it doesn't tell you in every situation exactly what should be done. So they think, therefore, it's it's an abstraction worthy of Plato or something, not realizing that principles aren't supposed to tell you exactly what's supposed to be done. They're supposed to be a guidepost to help you judge in an individual situation that's rooted in a particular context, a time, and a place. And so, yeah, one person stealing the same horse, and you're going to have drastically different remedies or punishments or whatever. And it makes perfect sense if you understand what a principle is and how it's supposed to be used.
Well, you've got castle doctrine laws and stand your ground laws, which are modern attempts to grapple with difficult proportionality questions.
Yeah.
I would argue that anybody coming into your house, really at any time of day, especially at night, the uncertainty there warrants lethal force. And so in Jeff Deist land, I would not charge that homeowner with a crime. Or if I sat on a jury, I would vote to acquit that homeowner. But then let's say you're not home and you arrive home to see a thief with your big screen TV, halfway out of your yard running towards a waiting car. Can you plug him in the back with whatever your Glock these days has, like 40 rounds or something? Can you go crazy and shoot this guy full of holes when he's no physical threat to you, apparently, running away, unarmed, let's say, with your TV, which is property? And then, that's not so easy in Jeff Deist land, because if you say no, lethal force is absolutely not warranted in that instance, and we're going to charge you with, let's say, manslaughter or some sort of unlawful killing short of murder.
Right.
Well, then all of a sudden it's like that's a slippery slope, because in our world, property is a big thing, right? That TV is not just a TV; it represents almost your life energy, your life force. You go out and you use your brain and your hands and your voice and other things to make a living in this world, and that manifests itself in property apart from just your physical body, and that might include your TV. So if we don't allow people to defend their property with lethal force, we're almost kind of denying them the full benefits of their labors, their life force, their life energy. And I think there are plenty of libertarians who would say, yeah, you can shoot the guy 40 times in the back stealing your TV. But I get, and I would say, no, you can't. That's excessive. But it just shows that there's proportionality issues.
Proportionality, exactly.
And if you live in a really rough neighborhood where that kind of stuff is just constantly going on, and it absolutely destroys the quality of life in that neighborhood, and you're on a jury, in that context, you might say, yes, we're going to acquit you for shooting the TV thief because, my gosh, we have to do something.
Yeah.
Whereas in a really fancy neighborhood where this is a extreme rarity, and you live amongst a bunch of Amy Klobuchar limousine liberals, you might say, hey, come on. I mean, yeah, you don't want TV thefts, but the guy was no threat and you killed him.
Well, yeah,
So
I mean,
contextual.
exactly. As we just said, it's the context that changes, which is fine. I mean, that's how the law is supposed to work. And I'm also sort of fine with legal systems that even if there's no obvious place to draw the line, like the classic example is underage laws or something. At some point, a growing adult is a child and has to be treated as such, and at some point they can be an adult and sign contracts and do all this other stuff. And where that is, that's not given to us from on high. It's something we sort of have to make a decision and okay, it's this age, it's 18 or whatever.
Right.
And you can have similar, lines for the person who's no longer a physical threat, but they're, they got your property. And at some point, I'm okay with law, like any other human endeavor, can't be perfect. So we know some decision has to be made about where to put the line. And I'm sort of okay as long as it's not obviously placed wrong, something egregious.
Well, but there's also law and governance outside of the state.
Mm-hmm. True.
Even
Yeah.
today. Not that long ago, 30 years even, certainly 50 years ago, there was far more of what we might today call vigilante justice.
Mm-hmm.
Right? A guy was known to have raped a young girl, and he would get a very unpleasant visit from some men in the neighborhood. That was a cultural or familial mechanism of law, right? Even today, there are all kinds of laws within prisons, right? Prisoners have codes. They have legal codes amongst themselves. Certain things are okay. Certain things will get you in big trouble. So, law takes many forms. And
also there's many, many, many more ways to influence the behavior of your fellow man other than the legal system. We're supposed to have a correcting effect on each other, just friendships, just from association, and once you bring economics into that, there's a whole nother level. And it's interesting, people these days forget that. They'll look at any societal harm and think, well, there ought to be a law, like that's the only thing that we can possibly do to change.
Yeah, but at the same time, they're working so hard to get rid of any social opprobrium.
Right? Isn't that
so
weird?
It's like even as we have less internal governance, we want more external, right? So it's like, how dare you ever judge someone for whatever they do, and then of course always put on social media like, there's no private lives anymore, seemingly. But then we want government to come along and do far more than it ever did, like criminalize hate speech, for example.
Yeah.
Right, which nobody can define.
That's one of its virtues, right? I mean, that's a feature, not a bug.
Right, you're always living under this intolerable sort of what if system, and that's what San Francis termed anarcho-tyranny, which we are experiencing here in the U.S. right now, and I think Donald Trump's getting a little bit of that.
A little bit,
right? I mean, a $450 million bond, which has never been required in the entire history of the state of New York, which has lots of big lawsuits happening there. I mean, that's just an example of, hey, look, we're basically criminalizing your dissent. We're placing you outside the bounds of acceptable candidates for president of the United States. And if you insist on continuing to do what you're doing, we're going to, destroy you financially. Well, okay. So authoritarian governments have always loved the idea of subjective application of the law. They've always
Yeah,
loved that.
on Twitter and in casual conversation, even I bring up that term anarcho-tyranny all the time. And the classic form of it is that bodega operator in New York who was attacked by some, thug, who was beating the hell out of him, obviously going to kill him. And he turned the tables and managed to kill the guy who was attacking him, and just immediately gets grabbed up and thrown in jail. And thank goodness the public, even in New York, the public was outraged. They didn't think, and I think they ended up releasing that guy. So it's nice to know that even in a place like that, the public isn't so cowed that they'll just let that happen.
Yes, we hope. We
We
certainly
hope.
hope.
Well, I had a bone to pick with you, Mr. Deist, when you left the Mises Institute, because I just loved what you did at the helm of that organization. But then I heard about monetary metals and what it is that you're doing there, and I thought, okay, I forgive you. This seems like a very, very worthy endeavor. Maybe you could tell us about it.
Well, we're just using physical precious metals for finance to finance production. Something like $14.5 trillion worth of physical gold only on Earth at today's market cap, and most of that is sitting around. It's in vault storage. So not only is it not working, it's actually costing money.
Right.
Vaults cost money. You've got to secure them, and then you got to insure it. If you had $14 trillion worth of commercial real estate, let's say skyscrapers in big cities, you would be doing all kinds of things with that. You would be using it as collateral. You would be lending against it. You might be borrowing against it, whatever it might be. You would view those buildings as a huge financial asset to be leveraged for whatever use, financial use, economic use. And really the same thing with gold. I would argue that gold is even more of a financial asset than real estate. It's more liquid, obviously. But more importantly, gold still has a monetary use, I would argue. It's not money. We're not going to go back to a gold standard. Gold. I don't think gold is going to go to $5,000 an ounce. And if it did, the rest of your life would probably not be too pleasant. And so I'm not a gold person in that sense where I tout gold as an investment or as future money. I don't think, but it does have an element of being a financial asset. There's no question about that. And the proof for that is that it continues what it trades for, a little over $2,000 an ounce. Well, if we just looked at its jewelry and industrial uses, its commodity uses, those wouldn't justify $2,000 an ounce.
Right.
So there's some element of moneyness still to gold, even when governments don't allow us to use it. And this is especially true in the East, in Asia and India, and it's especially true in the Middle East, in Turkey and Dubai and places like that. There's still people view gold more as a monetary asset. So we're trying to use physical gold, put it to work, financing production, where we're doing gold bonds and gold leases, using it just like you would cash money.
Yeah.
But financing mines, refineries, some jewelry manufacturers, and so it's an interesting business, and I'm learning a lot.
I'm going to read you a quote by one Jeff Deist that really struck me as just being fabulous, and I want to see if you still hold to this.
If I remember it, God.
Oh, don't worry. It'll come to you. You said, "I believe monetary metals can be as disruptive to finance as Uber was to taxi cabs." Do you still hold to that?
That seems like a pretty bold statement.
It does. Yes, it does.
But there is this idea that Uber is a fascinating experiment because it just came along. It operated in a gray area, and it did what it did. And by the time the politicians could sort of get around to wrestling with it, it was already too popular to do away with.
Way too popular, yeah.
And Uber, the beauty of Uber is, let's say you're at a restaurant, you can sit in the restaurant and wait and see where the thing is. You don't have to go out and stand outside, So it's obviously wildly superior to the standard tax cab where you go out at 2 a.m. after you're in a bar in New York City. You got to find one and wave it down, and it's cold and it's rainy. I mean, that's a terrible experience. So obviously superior that regulators had a real hard time with it. I don't think they'll ever view gold that way. I think they will always seek to. I don't think they'll ever allow gold to be used as money again. I mean, that would take a really serious, I think, civilizational change. So I don't view it so much that way. But in the meantime, I think we can basically get, again, $14 trillion worth of gold laying around. I think we can get it working. And that's it's basically, especially right now, it's very, very hard for businesses to raise capital right now, equity capital. It's hard for them to borrow. If you're a startup right now and you need to raise $10 million for your tech startup, it is much, much harder than it was 5 years ago, wildly harder than 10 years ago. So obviously with rising interest rates since COVID, we're in a different lending environment. And so why let all that gold just lay around when it could be financing stuff?
Oh no, I totally agree. But yeah, I still hope that that what you guys are doing can be Uber-like, because I just love, we may not be able to have a revolution and overthrow the state or something, but I do think it can weaken, and private institutions can grow around it. And if it moves
Yeah,
fast enough that
yeah. And the Bitcoin question is directly tied to all this. Is Bitcoin just something that sort of flies under the radar long enough before regulators realize what's happened and that it's being effectively used and it's superior in its transferability across time and space? And so, it just sneaks up on people. Hayek talked about a form of money that did just that. And I think I read something, might have been Stefan Livera, might have been Stefan Kinsella, two Stefans. I can't recall. I read something the other day, but it was basically like, we won't know. It's very hard to know. And that could take many, many decades. It could take even hundreds of years, right? I mean, before things change to the extent that gold has some pure money use or something, or that Bitcoin replaces the sovereign currencies of all these terrible governments around the world. It's just so unknowable. And I'm certainly interested. I certainly buy it, but I'm just not wired. Maybe I'm too old, but I'm just not wired to be a true believer type who goes all in, on Bitcoin, because I just think the future's too uncertain. And that uncertainty makes me think that gold will have a role because it has for 5,000 years. And so past performance, no guarantee of future results, but nonetheless, that 5,000 years makes me, I guess in a sense, I view gold as old tech, but enduring tech, like the wheel. The wheel is old tech. Fire is very old tech. We still use both those things today. Gold's not as old as either one of them. So I do think, I hope that there's a future for gold, and I hope that there's a future for this company I'm with.
Yeah, no doubt. On a completely different note, I was just having a discussion with a buddy of mine. You mentioned fire and the wheel and gold. We were arguing about what the most impactful invention of humanity ever was, and I have a candidate that's a little weird. I went with blanket. What are you going to do without a blanket in this world, Jeff?
Is that clothing? Is a blanket clothing, or is it separate?
Well, this is a hot dog a sandwich, right? Yeah, yes, I believe clothing is a blanket.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that was probably animal products at first,
For
right?
sure. Yeah.
Wrap yourselves in the warm entrails of a gigantic buffalo you just killed with 10 other guys or something. But
exactly.
yeah, I guess human beings have a naturally cautious nature because, we're born into this world pretty helpless, naked, quivering, and it takes a lot to build all the security and wealth that's around us. And so, maybe there's something deep in our DNA that makes us cling to something like using gold as opposed when the future is right in front of us, but we just can't quite accept that it's Bitcoin or whatever it might be. I don't know, but
Yeah, I don't have firm opinions on it. Much smarter men than I are on different sides of it, but my knee-jerk approach to it is that I'm going to lean towards gold rather than Bitcoin just because of the arbitrariness of Bitcoin. Like, the tech is amazing, but it really is just an artificial construct. You could create another one, with using a different set of ones and zeros. What's so special about this one, created by Satoshi or whoever? And you can get, I think, most of the virtues of the digital nature and still be tied to a commodity. I don't think there's a technical reason why that's, impossible. And yet, I don't know, weirder things have gained traction and stuck around. So I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Bitcoin could be universally accepted as money and have gathered so many network effects that no rival using the exact
yeah,
same open
yeah.
source code could overcome it. So I just don't know. I wish I had more, but I'm like you. I was unwilling to throw a bunch of money at it at the time where it made sense. So
Well, I'm friends with Saifedean Amos, and obviously I've read his books, and he is a true believer, to put it mildly.
he
And I
argues
think
the case very
right,
well.
right. And there's a case that says, hey, look, it's going to come along, and it's going to be the automobile to the horse and buggy, and automobiles became ubiquitous, at least in the United States, about 100 years ago. People really started having them in droves, maybe 1910s. Uh, and horses are still around, but horses aren't really transportation for most people. They might
Right.
exist on a
Leisure.
farm or
Yeah.
something like that, or wealthy people, or horse racing, or other uses. So the argument would be that gold will still be around, that it'll be those aforementioned jewelry and industrial uses rather than money. And that may well be true. I'm certainly so. Our founder is a guy named Keith Weiner, who's an economist as well and a tech guy before that. So he's very anti-Bitcoin. He makes all the arguments against it. One of his biggest arguments is just the sheer volatility.
Right.
Makes it really bad money and bad for finance. The Bitcoin maxis will say, well, that volatility is growing pains.
Right.
And so what makes Bitcoin unique or better than, as you said, you could replicate it, is its adoption and its first out status. So these are really complex questions, and how money works is it's so conceptually simple, and yet in the global system today, how money and credit and debt, including government debt, actually, how all that actually flows, the plumbing of it is so hellishly complex that it obscures a lot of that fundamental understanding of
sure.
money, and it's very difficult. And frankly, economists don't much understand monetary plumbing.
No, we're trying to discover it, the rules, the way it
Right,
works. I can't
right.
shake the notion that it has to be fundamentally a real thing, a commodity. One of my favorite science fiction, it's a trilogy. It's called The Golden Transcendence, I think, by John C. Wright. And it's set several millennia in the future. And the currency at that time and that place is milliseconds of computer time of the AIs that are instrumental in helping run this world. And I thought, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Whatever it is, it's most integral, and satisfies the characteristics of money as defined by whoever, the list of 6 or 7 characteristics. It just made perfect sense that in a world, in a digital world where AI and computing power is the essential thing, yeah, why wouldn't it have become money? And if you tie yourself to something weird like Bitcoin, you're sort of short circuiting something that I think is essential, but I can't prove it.
Well, technology will change, but the fundamentals won't. Human nature won't change. We
Right.
know that. And
Right.
one thing Rothbard talked about was, you don't have to worry about the money supply, right? Prices adjust. It's just when you alter the money supply rapidly, it tends to benefit earlier recipients over later recipients. That's why we shouldn't have all this monetary policy and this tinkering around. But the money supply per se is not something to worry about. But a lot of people in the Austrian camp have indeed worried about the idea of a fixed supply of Bitcoin. In other words, in Rothbard's world, the market provides money. At that time, during most of Rothbard's life, that would have been gold. And so even gold, the money supply grows. I mean, let's say gold went to 3,000 tomorrow. All of a sudden, and somehow the inputs cost stayed the same. So the all-in sustainable cost for mines was roughly what it is today. So, a lot of mines would go into 24-hour production if it went from 2,000 to 3,000. But even in history, when mines have done just that, bringing more than 1 or 2% of the existing gold online in a single year is a Herculean effort. Mm-hmm. It's very, very difficult to increase the supply of gold on Earth more than, let's say 1% a year. Very difficult. So that makes gold hard money. That gives it a good high stock to flow ratio, which Saifedean talks about in his book, The Bitcoin Standard. It's not as high as Bitcoin, because in Bitcoin you've got a truly immutable ultimate money supply. And so whether that's too inelastic for an economy ultimately, I guess not, because you can use digital fractions to take a certain an individual Satoshi out as far as you need to. But right. But in Rothbard's, and frankly in Mises's monetary understanding, the supply of money would not be fixed, but would rather be determined by the marketplace rather than central banks.
Yeah, as it should be. Do you have any quick response to the objection to gold that we might stumble across an asteroid that's got 18 gazillion ounces of gold in it, and we capture it, and all of a sudden the supply of gold is just the market's flooded?
Yeah, does it hit Earth? Is that the idea?
I'm going to say no. We send
then
Bruce,
we might have
Bruce Willis out in the shuttle, and he tows it back.
Oh, okay. So we just put a tractor beam on it and pull it in.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, who knows how much gold is out there? That's another, in the universe. I have no idea. I don't. That doesn't keep me up at night. I'd be more worried about the dust cloud from the asteroid.
For sure. Now, my stock answer is that markets adjust. All human endeavor adjusts, and at least if it's based in a free market situation, obviously there'll be tumult, but it'll be less than if it were a government solution or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a weird question to ask you, and it might be weird because it might be based on a hallucination. Am I misremembering, or did you write a few articles where you were giving non-libertarian, just generic life advice to young people? How to act, how to dress, how to behave?
I've done a little bit of that. I guess it's just...
I really like that.
Yeah, no, just there's a lot of young people who cycled through the Mises Institute, either through one of their actual seminars, their summer university, or through, just a website or something like that. I'm guilty of a little bit of that.
Oh, it's not guilt. I mean, you're supposed to rub off in a positive way on our youth, right? I really like that you did that.
Yeah, it's not fun to start to think of yourself as the older cohort.
Sorry.
But it is, it is what it is. And, a lot of 20-somethings are really struggling.
Oh, yeah.
Let's be honest. And I do think they've been screwed on the housing thing. The U.S. population has just grown way faster than the housing stock, or the decent housing stock. I think that's undeniable. So it's not just monetary policy or low interest rates or something like that. I mean, at some point, it's like you got to build houses, and there's the regulatory environment is such that it's very, very tough. There ought to be small starter homes for, let's say, $100,000 to $150,000, and these ought to be doable from a regulatory and a building cost standpoint. And then a young, so let's say a young person makes $30,000 a year. $100,000 house is not outrageous in that scenario. So I really think we've got a real problem with housing. I think baby boomers, basically through no virtue of their own other than the timing of when they happen to come along on this earth, really, really had it good in that sense. And they're all sitting around in these 6-bedroom, 3,200 square foot gigantic houses. And I don't know who they think they're going to sell them to when they get ready to move to the senior place in Florida, because the under 40s have 0 or 1 kid. They don't need a 6-bedroom, 3,200 square foot house, you know. So we've got a real disconnect.
I think what you're going to end up seeing is a lot more communal living, because what other option is
Yeah.
there?
Yeah.
So people will get together in a little cadre, and they'll get together and pool their resources to buy the
Yeah.
house.
Well, but the housing thing filters down to the entire sense of well-being of 20-somethings.
Oh, of course.
And it goes to marriage, to family formation, to optimism, to work ethic. You know, if I can never buy a house, let's say, or that may not be true, but let's say that's my mindset. Well, then maybe I should just lease that goofy $700 a month car.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe why save? Maybe I should just go to Europe instead of,
Yeah.
you know,
You raise your time
You're right.
preference, and time preference is civilization. You know, you need to lower it or you can't thrive. You can't have a society. And as you said, you know, it's all up at the foot of government, all these zoning restrictions and other impediments to increasing the supply. And it's
And
just
huge,
tragic.
I mean, but huge subsidies to homeowners too.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah,
in
of
so
course.
many ways. I mean, the amount of people in the U.S. who were baby boomers, who very quietly, unobtrusively, you know, just your neighbor next door type, nothing flashy, have a net worth of, let's say, $2 to $5 million. It's absolutely staggering.
It's
I mean,
crazy.
they're just it's just crazy amount of people, and yet they're getting that $2,000 a month from Social Security. You know, basically off the backs of young workers. So that's a huge problem. And of course, home ownership itself has been hugely subsidized, not only through the you know, the home building lobbies in Washington, but through monetary policy, lower interest rates, and through the tax policy, the deductibility of mortgage payments. So it's something that really concerns me, that because, I mean, I'm a Gen Xer, and we were fortunate enough to have that period of the 80s and 90s where, you know, we felt pretty optimistic. Yeah, there was the Cold War, and the Soviets might blow us up and a few other things. But then it's like only a pretty optimistic, happy country could even have, you know, Bananarama, right? I mean, it's like how right? I mean, whereas if you look at music today, it's a lot more neurotic. It's not fun. You know, I was in the gym the other day with my son. He's 18, and so it was on some classic rock station. They were playing like Rat and Motley Crue and Van Halen, and my son is very distantly sort of has heard of those bands. And I was just explaining to him, you know, music used to be, it was fun. It wasn't this moody sort of, you know, it was about girls and cars and getting wasted, you know. And I just think of that sense of optimism is such an important birthright. The idea that, you know, if we do what's right, we'll probably be at least as well off financially as our parents. And, you know, I generally feel like I have a pretty good future. And if you take that away from young people, that is a crime. That's a crime.
Well, what you said just reminded me. I mean, not only is it terrible, the financial things they did to young people of both sexes, but especially for boys. I mean, for 10 or 15 years now, they've been told by, you know, in many school settings that what they are at essence is toxic by nature, and they are members of a oppressor class and guilty for sins that they couldn't possibly be guilty of. They just got here. And how debilitating is that? And talk about raising your time preference. You know, why in the world should you work hard to improve yourself if what you are is evil by nature? And I think we see that with suicides and this trans lunacy and just a general feeling of hopelessness out there. And it breaks my heart. Yeah, I don't have anything pithy to say about that. But
well, boys are different than girls. They need
of course.
more. They need wood shop. They need metal shop.
They need purpose.
Sports. They need all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And productive achievement. I'm not a Randian. I'm not an objectivist, but I certainly read all that stuff back in the day. And I think one of the most important things Ayn Rand ever said was, she was on so many interviews. I can't remember which one. The Phil Donahue ones were famous.
Yeah.
But somebody asked her, what is the purpose of man? And she said, productive achievement.
Mm-hmm.
And she also said that, the most evil man is the man without purpose.
Right.
Not the serial killer or the whatever you could come up with. The man without purpose. And I'm convinced that people without purpose basically outsource that to politics.
Oh, for sure. And I bet she would say that the man without purpose is the meta situation that creates all those other things, the serial killer.
It's the Wesley Mooch in her novel, right?
Yeah.
In other words, if you don't have a lot of agency over your own life, that tends to give you a perverse desire to rule over others.
I have more to ask you on that subject, but I want to start winding down the YouTube portion of this interview, and I'm going to do so by making you very uncomfortable and flattering you. I think the first time I met you was on the Contra cruise, right? With Tom and Bob?
Sounds likely.
I think that's right. And I knew who you were and your background, but you were sort of a new commodity to me. I remember all the hordes of jealous people as I got off the boat who were asking me about it. A few of them asked me, what's Jeff Deist like? And I said, I am not kidding. He's very impressive. He makes me want to be a better libertarian. And I really mean that. I'm very impressed by you. And I want to thank you for coming on and doing my little show.
Thank you very much. That's nice comment.
Is there anything that you want to direct people towards? Obviously, we'll put a link to Monetary Metals and the Mises Institute in the description here, but anywhere else?
Just my own Twitter at Jeff Deist.
We will definitely do that. All right. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, thanks, Adam.